Again. All right, cool. So I'm Stephen Samuel. Thank you so much for coming and making me part of this whole thing. This has been some of the most interesting stuff. The most interesting few hours when I've been really, really sleepy in my life. So I'm going to present some stuff from these four institutions, and you can see the gradual decline of my career. The bottom is where I started out. So I'm going to talk about two things: visual perspective taking and embodied perspective taking. I'm going to be as quick fire as I possibly can. If you know the following experiment, first of all, I'm very happy. If you don't, great. Please observe the following picture while it lasts. What number did one see? How many did one see?
96.
That's 69.
Exactly. It gets kind of weird. So the correct answer here is 69. If you turn the whole thing around, you can kind of see that. But what happens is 12 to 21% of adults say 96, including me. This is how I discovered that this paradigm kind of works, because I made this mistake myself. And this is because you kind of learn a rule. 6 is 9, 9 is 6. And if you apply that in a left-right piecemeal fashion, you'll come across the answer of 96, which is incorrect. Again, this was my mistake. So I've done this experiment with a number of young adults, and this is the percentage of people who say 96. It doesn't matter if they didn't get any questions from the woman's perspective before they saw this. I just did that for you because it makes it work a bit better, but it's not absolutely necessary for this to happen. So this, I'm going to present mostly stuff that I've already published, apart from right at the end, but this is all recent stuff. So the way that I've interpreted this is working with Jeff Cole and Melanie Cott, and I've done most of my work with them recently. Now, there's kind of two ways of thinking about visual perspective taking here. You have the agent-centered version, which is kind of the theory of mind and the spectrum, and you have the stimulus-centered version, which is what the 96 would give. The thing about stimulus-centered version is that it's a relationship between you and the stimulus, not really considering the perspective of the agent in a particular scene. Again, I fell for this too, so I'm not trying to make any comments about people's ability to take perspectives. The other thing to point out is that 69 is also egocentrically correct. So when we give participants this study, when people do say 69, we don't know if they're actually saying 69 because they've taken a perspective or because they're being entirely egocentric. So point from this particular study that some visual perspective taking is stimulus-centered, even level 2. And this means that an operation is performed on the stimuli in the belief that this will lead indirectly to a correct judgment about a perspective. And to make matters kind of worse, maybe, what would a stimulus-centered process look like? It would be 6 and 9, 9 and 6. And this is not social approach. Even if this process would give you a correct answer, you have not gone through an agent to get to it. So it's all about take-home messages there. So even level 2 VPT doesn't need to be particularly theory of mind. Is the best thing about it. Another one, quick fire again. This is a paper from a couple of years ago in Cognition. The woman in the photo knows that both lines of the wall are the same level. And this is because we get participants. However, how long did each line actually appear from her visual perspective? And this is the view that we gave participants. This is the actual view from her perspective, and we measured this, and it works out the closer line is about twice as long as the further line if you take a photograph of it. And what happens is participants, if you look at the bars, indicate that there's no difference in the line length between the left line and the right line. We let them do this with a slider, so they can say the left line is this long, the right line is that long. And you have the cluster of all the participants there. You'll see about half of participants judge the closer line to be longer, which is what you would expect. But also about half participants judge the closer line to be shorter, which is the opposite of what you'd expect and the opposite of correct geometric reasoning and any other thing you could think of. When we show them the actual image taken from her point of view, now they know the closer line looks longer. So people don't seem to be particularly good at perspective taking, but there are still problems going on with this particular study. So we did the same thing with the camera. So you remove the agent's knowledge from the equation by just saying, in this version, how long will each line appear in a photograph taken by the camera? And participants still can't tell the difference between line length. They still think the lines will appear the same length, even from a camera. When this went out to review, there were 11 experiments in this paper. It was really hard to convince people that participants were this bad. One reviewer said he's asked his students, he's put lines up on his wall, he's asked the students to do it, and they can all do it. This was online, this was an online quadric study. I'll show you some data from in a room in a moment. But they asked us to make the angle of perspective a bit more radical. So I had to do this during the pandemic. So I took pictures somehow of me doing this, balancing my iPhone in the basement. And you can see there was no difference, even if the lines were oriented vertically or if they were oriented horizontally. And from this perspective, the angle, the length of the line was very, very different. So overall here, about as many participants judged the closer line to the agent to a bit shorter. And fundamentally, people aren't very accurate when it comes to understanding what is a visual experience, or even alternative angles such as through a camera lens. This could be because these stimuli are resistant to categorization and language. You can't label a longer line and a shorter line if you're trying to imagine what it looks like visually in your head. Whereas most of the stimuli that we use in visual perspective taking experiments, sixes and lines and whatnot, they are labels pretty much by definition. So it's, how do we explain this? It's likely that participants simply applied an erroneous function, such as maybe vision overcompensates for stretching to depth. And luckily, I don't consider it my job to explain the errors. It's just interesting to know that they exist, and just how bad people are at this stuff. So take-home message from that is, when it's really, really visual, we suck at it when it comes to visual perspective. So we got really interested in it because people were so bad, and I managed to publish a paper of almost 11 null results in cognition. I was very, very happy. So we put participants in the lab, and what we had is we had them stand in that position where the lines on the wall are the same length, but they look like this. This is what it looks like from participants' point of view if you actually take a photo from where the participant is standing. And there was an experimenter who stood in the middle between the lines and said, you know, these lines are the same length. How long do they actually appear from your visual perspective? Do they appear the same length or do they appear different length? 53 participants said the same. So they effectively ignored their visual experience and possibly went with their knowledge. We then gave them a camera and asked them to take a picture of them where they stood. And obviously this is one time, so this is a digital camera. And then we asked them to look at the photograph that they just taken and asked them the same question again, but this time about the photograph. And now 100% of participants said that two lines were of different length. We then took the camera away, had them look at the lines again, and repeated the first question. And they went back to this first response. Right? So we don't even like thinking of our own visual input as a perspective in an image-like way. So bottom line from all this visual perspective taking stuff is there are many different ways in which people seem to be taking visual perspectives of the world, many of which are erroneous. And when we do so, we may not be generating anything like an image. We may not be thinking about perspectives. It goes back a bit to Torsten's point about noetic stuff. We have a data pool in our head and we apply that to other people's perspectives, assuming that that might be correct. It might not necessarily be very theory of mind, and it might not be particularly accurate. But when you have tasks where accuracy is the main response method, rather than response times, you can really get to the heart of representation of other people's visual experience and then see how bad it is. And we recently published a review paper of the menu of different ways in which people can solve different visual perspective taking problems. And I put VSPT here because I've included the spatial stuff. And this was a graph that we developed from a review of all this stuff. Just to pull one thing out here, adults generally and women and left-right judgments tend to lead to embodiment, and rotation is preferred. But if you go to the bottom right corner, if you give people contrary instructions, they will do whatever you ask. So people are very flexible, and there's lots of different ways in which we solve stuff and individual differences, as we've already been speaking about here. So essentially, it seems to be that visual perspective taking is a toolkit. Some of us have more tools than others, but there are many tools, and we select one correctly or incorrectly, depending on the problem and depending on who we are and our background knowledge and experience. It's a mess. But it's a very interesting mess. And I think it takes away from the idea that VPT is special, and it becomes more like a function skill. That's the first half, and now I'm going to jump to embodied perspective taking. In this particular experiment, we had participants locate a target digit from the perspective of an avatar. This is a top-down view. We said the avatar was wearing a red cap. And the idea is the avatar calls a number like a 6, and participants had a 4-button response pad in front of them, and had to press a response button that mapped spatially onto the target's location from their own perspective. So in this case, you find the 6 from the avatar's perspective, press a bottom right button, which is the location as you see it. So you're taking a perspective, but then you're responding manually according to the world as you see it. This is how it works from the shared perspective. Everything aligns, so it's the same response from the avatar's point of view and your own. And when it's from the side, you have to again pay attention. It's the top left from the avatar's location, but you have to press the top right button to make the correct manual response. So the reason we did this is we were interested in what we call orthocentric errors. So an orthocentric error would be making a manual response upon the perspective you have taken to locate the target digit, rather than on the world as you see it. And that would actually correspond to an empty square. And what we found was that that was the most common type of error. There were 34 orthocentric errors. Almost half of participants committed at least one. So not everyone did this, quite low number of errors in total to count. The alternative empty square, importantly, on the grid was never selected. So people are making manual responses upon an imagined perspective. And these orthocentric errors outnumbered all other error types combined. Even the distractor error was less frequent than orthocentric errors. So we then asked people to do the same thing, but we gave them a black circle instead of an avatar. And we described to half of participants that the black circle was an avatar, looking at the numbers. And to the other half, we said the black circle marks the bottom of the screen. We asked them to do exactly the same thing. So locate the correct target digit from the avatar's perspective above the bottom of the screen, but make a manual response according to where you see it. And we found absolutely no difference between the avatar and the bottom of the screen versions of it, which leads me to think that body perspective taking can be detected through errors, which made me really, really happy because it's really unusual. And it need not be social. Technically, they should be rotating when it's the bottom of the screen instruction, and yet they're still making embodied errors, orthocentric errors. Nevertheless, and I find that really weird. And here's a funky experiment. I've knocked this particular paradigm to death now. I should probably stop. But so this allows us to ask questions like whether we actually imagine ourselves in other locations in the world, take someone's perspective and we try to embody that perspective. So in this study, we put participants right up against the wall, one on either their left side or their right side, so that one perspective would be physically impossible. They wouldn't be able to move there, and the other one would be physically possible. And this time, we asked participants to actually press the button from the avatar's perspective. So we wanted orthocentric errors that were now correct responses. And the reason we wanted to do that is because we wanted people to imagine themselves around the grid, see if it would be impossible, if they'd be worse at doing so when they were all in play. So some trials and physical location that needed to be occupied was blocked off by a wall. And the test here was, would there be a difference when it was blocked off compared to when it was not? And the answer is no. So results suggest that embodied perspective taking is agnostic to the local physical features of the world in which we might be imagining ourselves in. We then did the black circle manipulation, and we found exactly the same effect. The wall had no effect on anything, even when they were imagining the black circle as the bottom of the screen. Everything else in the study worked as you expected in terms of what perspective was fastest and what was slowest. So, embodied perspective taking. Embodiment implies a representation that seems to be agnostic to features of the local physical world. And for my last study, I'm going to show you stuff that we haven't yet published. So, again, I thought I've got this paradigm to that. So there are two ways in which we can do this experiment. I've already presented both of them to you. On one hand, you can take the avatar's perspective and then make a response from the avatar's perspective, or you can take the avatar's perspective and then make a response from your own. So we have self-perspective trials and we have other perspective trials. And what we wanted to see here is if we can eliminate the speed advantage in taking your own perspective of things by giving people practice with manual responses from alternative perspectives. And the result, so we get in one block, for example, of self-trials first, where they make manual responses from their self-perspective, and then the other perspective block comes second, or vice versa. But it's important to note that you always have to take the avatar's perspective first to locate the target digit. It's only whether the subsequent manual response is from the self-perspective or the other perspective. So what we found is that when self-perspective trials come first, and this is the bit in the circle, participants were faster and more accurate in self-perspective and other-perspective trials, as you expect. We've got a centric advantage. But when the other perspective block came first, it was even a slight reversal. People were it's not statistically significant. They were faster from you have slow on self-perspective charts. So their egocentric advantage had not only been eliminated, but had gone in the direction of reversal. And statistically significantly, they were less accurate on self-perspective charts if they'd done a whole block of other perspective charts first. Each block was about 6 minutes long. So for this effect to occur, the effect of doing the first block has to last at least 6 further minutes for it to really come out in the data in the second block. So it takes a while for this embodiment effect to decay. So the take home from this is that practice with other perspectives seems to eliminate egocentricity in minutes and might reverse it. And this effect also seems to take minutes at least to decay. And the last slide, penultimate slide I want to show is a couple of the things I haven't spoken about, which I'm interested in, because it's also about what we talk about tomorrow, which is does embodiment create an in-group effect, which speaks very much to Torsten's stuff and my questions earlier, and does bilingualism make infants better perspective takers? I'm not speaking about that now because we don't have time. Thank you to my collaborators, and the slides are available on OSF. Thank you very much.
So kind of maybe continuing your conversation we had yesterday. So because you use this menu argument to say that theory mind really isn't a thing, it's a bunch of intractable things. And then
I have visual spatial perspective taking specifically.
Sorry, okay. Okay, but you could extend that to say that, okay, it's not a Fodorian modular thing, right? Okay. To play the coder's advocate, when you read him, he does say, we know that cognition is intractable, isotropic, whatever, but we can't study it like that. So let's just assume there are some modules at hand, right? So it's still compatible. Having intractable strategies of stuff is still perfectly compatible with modularity, which is kind of a, let's pretend there is a solution of a problem, even though we don't know.
Okay, can I take the defensive position? Yeah. These data do not allow me to make pronouncements upon Fodorian modules I expect to take. I mean, they literally don't. But it seems the evidence seems to point to, at least with VSPT, and I use VSPT numbers. Depends on your definition of visual perspective take, and the ICP. I have to save some things for the ICPS. VSPT, there seems to be this whole menu of stuff. Visual perspective taking, depending on your definition, if you think of it as representing someone else's visual experience, which is what most of these studies are supposed to be tapping into, it's more about accuracy and representation of response times. We're too bad at it for it to be modular. It would be the worst module that we had. Was there a question from you, Carl?
Yeah, I was waiting for you to finish your answer, but that was an abrupt ending to your answer. So yeah, I was wondering whether you ever tried a little bit more naturalistic stimuli, because we are also profound source talk. Basically, we're pretty shit at visual illusions. We don't believe them and all that. So basically, give people a chance. Yeah. So to basically imagine something that is easier for them to imagine from a naturalistic environment. Let's see if that produces better results.
That's a very good point. So there's some data that I've just been collecting on Friday. Data collection ended. I haven't had time to analyze it. It's something I'll be doing with Jeff Cole, so you can imagine the kind of direction that it's in. But it's
physics.
It's kind of it's
that's where it comes from, if I remember correctly.
I mean, he's a vision scientist or cognitive. He's more into vision than anything else. But it's got an actual person in front of you whose visual perspective you need to take, and there are things like color filters in front of her eyes or not, and shapes in front of her that are to one way or another. And the idea is to match the sample what you think she sees. It's not naturalistic. I mean, the sixes and nines, who thought sixes and nines would be a paradigm, but we use them because they're convenient. Naturalistic, I would love to do more. But maybe tomorrow we can give me some ideas.
Well, yeah, just basically, so with the two lines, basically, and the angle. So basically, so having, well, I don't want to say faces because all the face literature is basically it's too many faces have been used already, basically. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, we can talk about it, but it's just something like a toy or something like that, basically. or a fruit. Let's go for fruit. Conspicuous, basically. So 2 apples, basically. Which one? I think that people might be better than judging the lines in terms of which one appears bigger.
There was a great joke in Father Ted. You know Father Ted?
Hmm?
Living
Sure.
in Ireland now. Yeah, Father Ted is an Irish
Oh,
sitcom, you know.
Yeah.
And there's a joke about it, whether a cow is close or far away, or if it's small or large.
Yeah, well, object size constancy, basically. Yeah, so yeah, we're not very good at that either. We know that. Yeah, so basically, but from the perspective judgment, basically might just work because yeah, probably. Yeah.
The only thing I'd add to your, I mean, I agree, these are not naturalistic. So, I mean, even 2 lines on the wall, unless you're trying to chuck a frisbee through letterboxes or something like that.
Wow, that's a niche sport.
Great.
Or job.
Yeah.
The only thing I would say about it is that seems to me that it's analog information rather than digital. So it's very much the difference between the lines changes as I move. Whereas a 6 and 9 have to move quite a long way around, for example. And that's presumably how we actually experience the visual world, a bit more naturalistic. But I'm not saying it is naturalistic. I agree with your point. Maybe just a little bit better.
Yeah, but I definitely agree with you. It's definitely it's important questions to raise in terms of what do we actually really represent if we adopt another perspective. And well, I think today we've seen that it doesn't have to be another's perspective. It can be just another.
Thank you, that's really interesting talk. And I was thinking about your last experiment, 6, 9 quadrants. I was wondering, so these are sort of labeled self and other, but the self, you take the other perspective, and the self is the response. And I wondered how much of that particular kind of blocking effect might relate to that sort of integrating all with self rather than being self, if that makes sense. So you can never just stop taking the other perspective.
Completely agree. Yeah, and in everything in the paper, it's you have to be very clear that you're always taking the avatar's perspective first. It's just about what you do next that is different. I think the problem that we ran into was it's really difficult for stimuli to be ambiguous. You can't have a self perspective. I can't just take my own perspective all the time of a 6 and 9 because it's too easy. So a follow-up, we're doing a 4th experiment on this now, where it doesn't quite speak to your question, but maybe gets to it a little bit, which is where we're replacing the 6s and 9s with squares and crosses. Reason being that they are the same from all 4 angles in the experiment. If the effect of the first block on the second block is because you're disambiguating something from the other perspective first, then you should not find the same effect when you do a symmetrical stimuli like this. That is starting next week, so I don't have the data on that yet. But when I'm trying to do it myself, I found it incredibly easy across both trial types if I just have to locate the stimulus as I see it first. So I'm not sure anecdotally that I will find that self-other difference. So I think you do need to actually have this ambiguation phase first. But we'll wait and see, obviously, before I.
Excellent, really interesting. I mean, I wondered. I was one thought was just for the earlier studies where people were misjudging the length of lines and things. I wondered whether you might get different results if you consulted experts, so visual artists, for example, who've done.
That's
You spent 10 years learning how to represent perspective before it.
That's really interesting. It's the last paragraph of the discussion. Literally that with visual artists.
I understand that.
And that's why I'm here. No, that's exactly right. It's something that's worth testing. My guess would be they probably would be because they've how many of us have had to think about that kind of question? And this is why it's not incredibly naturalistic. Because we don't have to act upon the lines physically, for example. So it's a really hard question. But yeah, if you have to worry about perspective all the time, you might be better. But that would again feed into this individual differences.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think, and I guess broad thought was just, I mean, and this isn't meant to be in any way deflating.
I mean,
no, but I mean, it feels like it shouldn't be that surprising if one took a broader perspective in other cognitive domains, for example. If you think about i.e. physics or our understanding of physics and physical events and stuff like that, I think there's reasonably good evidence that there are some basic abilities that you see early development and show quite strong continuity through development, for example, for understanding physical objects interacting with each other, launching one another. But you know, you then acquire a whole bunch of folk physics, much of which is incorrect in certain conditions, right? And then if you you study physics, then you learn about Newtonian mechanics and quantum mechanics, and so you have layer upon layer of different kinds of knowledge that apply in various different situations and that you might misapply in various ways. And so I suppose what I mean is that no one thinks that there's no such thing as physics or folk physics, if you like. So I think the toolbox approach is a powerful one, and it seems quite common, if not ubiquitous, across the domains. So I think it's very revealing, but it might not be so surprising if you spoke to someone who studied physics, psychology, physics. So, well, yes, that's rather like my domain as well.
An ultimate paragraph of the gentleman's optic research.
Yeah.
The Venus effect is one that Jeff Hall's spoken about as well. It's my favorite. It's when someone looks at themselves in a mirror, so you think, but because they're actually looking at you, this is often used in film, you think that they're looking at themselves in the mirror, but actually if they're looking at you, they can't be looking at themselves in the mirror unless you're right behind them. And loads of adults think that the person's actually looking at themselves in the mirror, and that's put down to folk optics. I forget the name of the person who studies this up in Liverpool.
Rebecca Lawson.
Yeah.
There you go, thank you. And that kind of stuff must be being applied to, for example, the lines task, because what I would understand if people thought the closer line was longer, but varied in how much longer it was in the further line. But to flip and say the closer line is shorter suggests to me that they're applying some sort of folk optics, some bad activity to it, thinking that it's correct. So that could be one of them. And the best answer I have is maybe something about stretching to depth being compensated for. I mean, that's pretty poor. I'm going to leave that to Rebecca Lawson et al. to maybe think about. But yeah, folk optics is a big part of it. Yeah.
Okay, can I just, maybe it doesn't work out, but when you ask how does the line seem, can't that have two answers? Retinally it's this, but really it's that, right? So
yeah, but that's why the camera vision was in, because that one you can't confuse those two things. It's only imagistic, and they're equally as bad. I mean, there was a tendency to be there was a bit more of a gap between graphs, but the base factor was 0.3 in lower, so it still supports the null. So I was a bit surprised by that as well.